first of all would like to, that's good. I would first of all like to acknowledge my dear colleagues. My name is Rabbi Shimon Cowen, and I'm from the Institute for Judaism and Civilization. And this is happening with the very valuable collaboration of Campion College in Sydney. And I must thank, first of all, the president of Campion College, Dr. Paul Morrissey. And I would like to thank also the dean. And I would like to thank Anna Hitchings, who's very graciously coordinating this gathering. Now, I would like, if I may, just to give a brief overview of how the evening will proceed. There may be some, we may have to make some changes as time goes, as things go along. But we have, as you noticed, 4 speakers. Now, at least we had 4 speakers, we planned 4 speakers. And I will introduce them in turn. And one of them was the Honorable Barnaby Joyce, the Deputy Prime Minister. And he was interested to participate, but he had difficulties, and he was going to send a colleague. He said he wants to be represented at it. So they couldn't find parliamentary colleagues at the last moment. So I have done something quite novel. I have decided, I spent the afternoon researching his views on religious freedom from the internet, and I'll do my very best to present them. Hopefully you'll find them interesting. Now, so basically we'll have 4 speakers, and I'll introduce each of them in turn. In some cases, there'll be some time for some questions. Other cases, the presenter wants to speak at greater length, so I respect that. But there will be an opportunity for general questions at the very end. And then I will leave it to my colleague, Dr. Stephen Chavura, to conclude the evening's proceedings. I understand that Anna will be handling the questions, and so that when the time comes for questions, they'll go through her.
Yeah, if I could just jump in there, actually. Questions will just come straight through the chat. So, so if you want to ask a question, just ask through the chat.
Okay, so very good. Okay, fine.
And perhaps before we begin, Rabbi, you could just let me know who else we will be speaking tonight, just so I can take care of their mute now, so that they can just unmute themselves when their time comes to speak.
It could be that the speakers will join us at different times.
I think I see the good senator now, actually.
That's right. We have our first speaker will be Senator the Honourable Concetta Fioravanti Wells, a member of the Liberal Party, an important senator. And then after that, we will have Monica Smith, who is a leader of the United Australia Party, which recently merged with Reignite Democracy Australia. Then I will make a presentation of Mr. Barnaby Joyce's views. I'll be standing in his place. And then the 4th speaker will be Steve Campbell, who will be joining with us from Perth, and he is the Federal Secretary of the Labor DLP. So those are the 4 speakers, and Stephen Chavura will wrap things up at the end. We'll have a question period also. All right. Well, now, just to introduce briefly the proceedings. Everybody knows that we are at a very crucial time in Australian history. And I'm sure that this situation is felt around the world. There has never been greater threats to religious freedom in the West, in the Western world. And I'm very sad to say that Australia, in some respects, represents one of the direst conditions and states of religious freedom in the West. And that's why our situation is so urgent. It is a matter now of raising consciousness of the threats to religious freedom in Australia, and to exert whatever political means are available to the Prime Minister to make good his promise to protect religious freedom. And I fear that if the Prime Minister doesn't live up to his promise, then the matter may have electoral consequences, and we may be part of those electoral consequences. At all events, I want to outline very briefly 5 areas in which there are major threats to religious freedom in Australia. The first relates to the very existence of faith groups, and that is because we find that faith groups actually maintain their existence through their own institutions, through their schools, through their prayer community, through their communities, and of course through their families. And yet we find legislation in Victoria and in some other states which come in a very oppressive manner to prevent schools, ministers, and parents from communicating key values to their children, where these are seen as inconsistent with certain gender ideologies. And these are being backed up in Melbourne and Victoria, for example, with jail sentences, with fines, with the criminalization of therapists and so on. So that is very serious. And in addition to that, we find attempts, also legislation, which is in the Victorian Parliament, to force religious schools to employ staff whose personal lifestyles, manifested lifestyles, contradict the school's ethos. That's also a major threat to the existence of faith groups. Then we find that there is a threat to the outer life, to the life of faith communities within the wider society. And this is found, once again, I'm sad to say that I can bring an example for every abuse from Victoria, the state in which I live. This is found in new proposed vilification laws, which are to make the expression of values which, quote, are likely to offend, not which do offend or are intended to offend, but which are so-called likely to offend, subject to vilification. This acts to muzzle religious groups in their expression within the public sphere. Then we come to the issue of freedom of conscience in private life, and this also is a case where there is legislation now to criminalize the access to therapy which a religious individual, by exercise of his or her own autonomy, wishes to have in order to deal with, let us say, gender dysphoria. The person's own conscience is unhappy with it. And yet there's legislation which makes it criminal to access therapy to live in accordance with one's own conscience. So that's one violation of conscience in the private sphere. In the public sphere, we have many issues, unfortunately. In abortion law, doctors who have a conscientious objection to abortion are forced to refer to another doctor who they know to have no objection. Now that is a form of complicity. That is not really a proper recognition of freedom of conscience. And finally, we find a major erosion of religious freedom in the attempt to break up the family. The family is the fundamental unit of transmission of religious faith and practice. When the state comes in to separate children from parental influence, it strikes at the heart of faith communities themselves. We, as faith communities, we educate our children. We educate them in our homes. We educate them in our schools. We educate them in our congregations. When the state comes in with programs which seek to actually pry the child away from parental influence, then we have a very serious violation of freedom of religious existence here. And this is manifest in a number of ways, through the Safe Schools program, which teaches children values which are contrary often to their parents' values, through the attempt to give the children so-called mature minor status, which would allow them to undergo radical physical therapies, transitioning without their parents' knowledge or consent. And similarly also by criminalizing the provision of therapy or even parental guidance to children in matters of their own personal development. So all in all, we are in a very critical situation, and there is or in almost each of these domains, critical domains of religious freedom, there is legislation in existence or legislation in the pipeline which threatens religious freedom in either of these ways, in any of these various ways. So I would like now to introduce our speakers. As I mentioned, there will be opportunities for questions as we go along. Sometimes it will be after a speaker, sometimes it will be at the end of the session or before the wrapping up. I would like to, if anybody is interested in a background paper, which I produced on this topic, if it's of value to you, I'm very happy to send it to you if you contact me by email. So without further ado, it is for me an honor to introduce Senator the Honorable Concetta Fierravanti-Wells. And the senator is a very experienced politician, and she has been in a ministerial rank, and she is trained as a lawyer and has had a host of responsibilities. But in my eyes, the greatest distinction is that she is a person of untiring effort in the area of concern and protection of religious freedom. And Senator, we're most honored and grateful that you've joined us today, and we would like to hear you, please. Thank you very much.
Well, can I thank you, Rabbi Shimon, Cowen, and the Institute for Judaism and Civilization and Campion College for organising this webinar on an issue that is so important to all of us. At the outset, I want to outline what the current position is of the government, and then I'll make some further comments. Now, the government maintains that Australians should not be discriminated against because of their religion or lack thereof as they go about their everyday lives, and that this is the fundamental principle that will be set out in their religious discrimination bill. Now, the government asserts that it will protect Australians from religious discrimination as they are protected from age, sex, race, or disability discrimination. Now, it argues that it will protect ordinary Australians from discrimination because of their religion, because it takes the issue of discrimination against Australians on the grounds of their religious beliefs very seriously. Now, the Prime Minister made a commitment to Australians to address this issue at the last election, and the government asserts it is progressing that commitment in a calm and considered process. It maintains that it has been listening and aiming to get this right. This is important legislation which requires a methodical and measured approach. Now, on this basis, the government prepared a package of draft legislation to implement the recommendations from the May 2018 report of the expert panel to the Religious Freedom Review, including a religious discrimination bill. Now, the government has conducted 2 rounds of public consultation on draft legislation and met face-to-face with over 90 stakeholders in a series of roundtables. Now, the government asserts it has heard from all sides of the Australian community and continues to meet with stakeholders so all input can be considered. Now, I'm advised that the Attorney-General is working to progress the religious discrimination bill by the end of the year. Now, I want to put this into a bit of historical context, if I may, Rabbi. On the 29th of August 2019, then Federal Attorney General Christian Porter released the Religious Discrimination Act 2019 Draft Exposure Bill and related bills, which were the Religious Discrimination Consequential Amendments Bill 2019 and Human Rights Legislation Amendment Freedom of Religious Bill 2019. Now, these bills dealt with discrimination on the basis of religious belief, but only in key areas of public life. They did not create a positive right to freedom of religion, which religious leaders, experts and stakeholders have been calling for and which meet our international obligations. Now, following the release of draft 1 of the bills, it was clear from my ongoing consultations and engagement with religious leaders that the bills fall far short of properly and fully addressing their requirements for religious freedom protection. They want a positive right that allows people to live in accordance with their convictions. Now, the submissions to Draft 1 bills closed on the 2nd of October 2019, and the concerns about the bills, which were numerous, were manifested in the reported 6,000 submissions. Now, whilst religious leaders may have theological differences, they demonstrated strong solidarity amongst themselves in their response to the Draft 1 bills, unified in their fight to protect freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Now, in a joint letter from faith leaders to Scott Morrison and Christian Porter, dated 22 November 2019, they stated, in its current form, and I quote, in its current form, the bill will diminish the religious freedom of faith groups in Australia, and we take the view that it would be better to have no Religious Discrimination Act than a flawed one. Now, religious leaders, experts and stakeholders across the faith spectrum raised serious concerns about Draft 1 bills. They fell far short of properly and fully protecting religious freedom, and hence it was not surprising that the government had to revise the draft. Now, following the almost 6,000 submissions and strong pressure from religious leaders, experts and stakeholders from across the faith spectrum, on the 10th of December 2019, the Morrison government released its second draft of the exposure draft bills. Now, whilst the government had moved on some issues, again, draft 2 of the bills fell far short of properly and fully protecting religious freedom. Now, submissions on draft 2 closed on the 31st of January 2020. Now, the COVID-19 crisis has meant that the government's legislative agenda and program in many policy areas has been halted, and priority was given to COVID-19 legislation. As I have said all along, Australians of family and faith need to feel protected in expressing their freedom of speech, their freedom of thought, their freedom of conscience, and their freedom of religion. And ultimately, it will be the assurances given by faith leaders to their congregations that the bills fully protect their religious freedom. Now, whatever the politicians may say, what matters here is what the faith leaders preach and tell their congregations, which will dictate if their political expectations have been met. So why is religious freedom so important to Australians of family and faith? And I saw this at the last federal election, especially with the Israel Folau sacking. Now, at the kitchen table, Australians of family and faith were concerned. If I say something about my religion, will I find myself in trouble? Now, as I said, it's about freedom of speech, conscience, thought, and freedom of religion. And they asked, if it can happen to Israel Folau, it can happen to me. And if it does, will I too face the legal hassle of being hauled up before a court, a tribunal, for simply quoting from my Bible? Now, the Folau issue heightened an already existing concern about incursions on religious freedom. Ordinary people of faith were concerned and they held the strong perception that quoting the Bible would get them into trouble. Now, at the election in May 2019, religious freedom emerged as the sleeper issue. And during the election, there was the strong perception, and the strong perception was that Scott Morrison would protect or be in a better position to protect their religious freedom. So many of those quiet Australians, as Scott Morrison described them, who voted for him and the coalition, did so in the expectation that their religious freedoms would be protected. And the vote, especially in culturally and religiously diverse communities in Labor's heartland seats in Western Sydney, saw swings of up to 6 to 7%. These were effectively the same seats that had strong no votes during the same-sex marriage survey. So accordingly, Scott Morrison, and following on, Rabbi, from what you said, Scott Morrison needs to meet those expectations to retain that electoral support. Now, the test of whether that has been met as I said, will depend on what those religious leaders advise their congregations. Now, although religious freedom is a right enshrined under international law, there has been, before the last election, a continued and sustained push, especially by Labor and the Greens, for laws to take away the rights of Australia's faith-based communities. Now, the results in the last election had their antecedents in the same-sex marriage debate. Now, of the 17 federal electorates that voted no, 12 were in New South Wales, with the majority falling in Western Sydney. Now, 8 of the top 10 no voting seats were in Labor-held seats. Now, following the introduction of same-sex marriage, we had all the problems with attempts then to remove the exemptions under the Sex Discrimination Act in 2018 and 2019. There were 2 Senate inquiries, which I participated in, regarding moves to remove these exemptions under the SDA. Now, the inquiries demonstrated overwhelmingly that the exemptions under the SDA provided a very important framework within which religious schools have operated to manage issues and ensure that students have been appropriately and pastorally taken care of. Now, the Senate Standing Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs received more than 9,000 submissions to the bill the bills under consideration. Now, during this time, I was able to meet with many religious leaders who additionally activated thousands of people in the wider community that shared the concerns about these bills, one of which had been brought in, called the Wong Bill, because she had introduced it. Now, the Senate released its report on the 14th of February 2019, which recommended that there be no changes to the SDA and that the exemptions for religious bodies and educational institutions be maintained and that the matters be referred to the Australian Law Reform Commission for consideration. Now, the position for Australians of faith is worsening. They want a positive right that allows them to live in accordance with their convictions. Alarmingly, though, there is a growing body of cases in Australia of people facing harassment, intimidation, and persecution because of their religious beliefs and actions. And sadly, some are even losing their livelihoods. Now, these cases are predominantly brought under state laws, and I've given a number of speeches in the Senate highlighting these cases and the challenges endured by those against whom they have been brought. Now, when freedom of speech, of thought, of conscience and belief is framed only as an exemption to other rights, they are read down against positive rights, rendering them subordinate to those other rights. So a regime of positive rights in the form of religious freedom legislation would give effect to the right to manifest one's freedom of thought, conscience and belief as outlined in Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Now, for a time, I continued to strongly advocate and work with religious leaders and faith-based communities for standalone religious freedom protection legislation. And for this reason, in June 2019, I launched a petition in the Australian Senate calling for the enactment of a Religious Freedom Act to protect the right to freedom of speech, thought, conscience and religion. Now, following this, I was able to table tens of thousands of original hard copy signatures in the Senate, and I am grateful to those people who took the time to sign that petition. Now, religious leaders, experts and stakeholders have continued to examine draft 2 of the bills in the context of their activities, depending on what their operations are, whether it's schools, universities, theological training, aged care, preschools or hospitals. They have carefully analysed their circumstances in their various submissions, and it is, though clear from certainly my ongoing consultations and engagement, that the bills still fall short of properly and fully addressing their requirements for religious freedom protection. As I stated earlier, there is still and there are still major problems with draft 2 of the bills. And I want to take the time to just briefly touch on some of these. So other than a statement in the objects clause, there is no mechanism to deal with clashes of competing rights. Now, this is especially of concern, as I've indicated earlier, given our obligations under international law. Now, without this, it will be left to the courts. And given our experiences, courts are not necessarily sympathetic to religious rights. Now, the definition of religious belief or activity is restricted to lawful religious activity. Now, this limitation extends to criminal and civil law, and hence things that are unlawful according to civil law, e.g. state and territory discrimination acts, and other regulatory matters like council ordinances could be captured. This could result, for example, in a state or local government enacting laws that make innocuous religious activities unlawful. For example, state faith-based aged care facilities or hospitals which are required under state law to facilitate things like euthanasia would not be protected. Now, state government could make funding of religious schools conditional on the schools not teaching their views of marriage or sexuality. So there are real concerns about the definition of statement of belief, giving rise to the fear that too much power would reside in the hands of judges to decide theology. There is a limitation to a belief that may reasonably be regarded as being in accordance with the doctrines, tenets, beliefs or teachings of the religion. Now, clearly this opens up the schism that the view of the court on gender, sexuality and marriage would not be in accordance with the doctrines, tenets, beliefs or teachings of a religion. Arguably, the test of reasonableness ought to be a test from the perspective of the average person of that religion. Now, further concerns arise that statements of belief are not protected if they are malicious, or that would or is likely to harass, vilify or incite hatred or violence against another person or group of persons. Now, the use of the word vilify is too wide and leads to uncertainty. Furthermore, the definition of what constitutes vilification is highly contestable and has been consistently used by the left to censor. For example, it was used to allege that Folau's citing the Bible was vilification. Indeed, those who subscribe to alternative views on gender, sexuality, and even same-sex marriage frequently attack traditional religious views as harmful and vilifying. And so there needs to be clarification that statements of belief cannot vilify. Now, the warnings that I and others gave during the same-sex marriage debate that religious freedom protections needed to be afforded at that same time were not heeded. Hence, we are now seeing the consequences of those failures to afford protection at that time. Now, the draft bills also raise the broader issue of national consistency and applicability of law. Let us not forget that Archbishop Porteous had complaints lodged against him for little more than a simple statement of religious belief. Now, in relation to charities, we need to make sure that they are not penalised for having a traditional view of marriage, and this is not clear in the bill. The exemptions for inherent requirements for a job are broad and vague and significantly reduce the protection for people of faith. There's concerns about the employer conduct rules, restricting the ability of an employee to make statements of belief outside of work hours, that they're not reasonable unless necessary to avoid unjustifiable financial hardship. Now, the $50 million threshold creates an anomaly, namely that it is open to small business to discriminate. Now, these are concerns. There are concerns that it is still open to those large organisations that if they want to stop someone saying a statement of belief in their spare time, they have to show there's undue financial hardship. Now, there remains concerns about hospitals and aged care facilities and conscientious objection. There needs to be improvement to enable permission for religious bodies to act in accordance with their faith-based hospital and aged care facility ethos. We need to look at proper conscientious objection by health practitioners. Conscientious objection narrowed to limited number of medical professions, and then only for a procedure, not an individual, still leaves exposed the cake makers, the photographers, etc. So there is no clarity on the issue of whether ministers of religion may refuse to solemnise marriages where the marriage is of two persons whose biological sex is identical, or where one or both of the parties now has a gender identity or legally recognised sex that differs from their biological sex. Now, with conscientious objection narrowed to a limited number of medical professions and then only for a procedure, as I said, I am very concerned about ministers and celebrants, etc., still being exposed. Now, some faith groups want a covering of the field when it comes to religious discrimination to the extent of any inconsistency between state and federal law when it comes to religious discrimination, with the federal law prevailing when it comes to religious discrimination. But above all, I have to say, state laws will remain untouched. There is a failure to address the hodgepodge interaction of the state-federal maze, and the bills do not address national applicability and consistency of legislation. Now, this creates problems for those religious institutions operating nationally, yet subject to different discrimination laws at state and territory levels. Now, serious transgressions against religious freedom have worsened as a consequence of state health orders imposed under cover of the COVID pandemic. And whilst religious leaders, as I said, may have theological differences, there is strong solidarity amongst them. They are unified in their fight to protect freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And as one religious leader has said to me, we just don't want to accept crumbs off the table. Now, it is possible that following considered analysis of the final bills, religious leaders, experts and stakeholders may just say no to the legislation. Now, at this stage, we are awaiting the final bills. Now, once they go to Cabinet, they will then go to the coalition backbench committee and then go to the coalition party room. Now, if the coalition party room approves the bills, they will be presented and debated in the House of Representatives. Now, if they're passed, the bills will then go to the Senate for debate. Now, the Senate will likely refer them to a Senate committee for inquiry. Now, I suspect the Senate committee will also call for submissions, undertake public hearings, and prepare its report to the Senate. Now, once the committee report is tabled in the Senate, there will likely be more debate. And I suspect, however, that given the current point of the electoral cycle, at best, I think the bills will simply end up in the committee stage and no resolution before the next election. I may be wrong, but I think time and given the sitting patterns between now and when the next federal election is likely to be, that this will be the case. Indeed, Rabbi Shimon, as you have articulated in your paper, these transgressions on religious freedom are contained in state laws, and you have provided a number of very vivid examples of Victorian law that go to the heart of the attacks on religious freedom. Now, as I said, the current bills do not override state laws. This is not the intention of the RDA bills. These bills are an attempt to afford some protection around religious discrimination. They are not framed around affording religious freedom. And given the existing disparate Commonwealth, state and territory discrimination framework, I believe a better and more long-term solution would be to consolidate discrimination law into federal legislation to ensure national consistency and applicability. And this is the only way that I believe that freedom of speech, thought, conscience and religion can coexist on an equal footing with other rights. Now, this would afford proper equality of rights and conformity to international obligations, including the protection of religious freedom. Accordingly, I have advocated that this is a better approach, and it would be to adopt a nationally consistent framework which would see a consolidation of all Commonwealth and state discrimination law. And this would afford a more effective and a long-term solution that would, as I have said, ensure equality of rights and conformity of our international obligations. And I think, Rabbi Shimon, this is the only way to effectively achieve the outcomes that you will outline in your paper. Now, according to a survey commissioned by the Australian Christian Lobby, 64% of those surveyed agreed that it was wrong to discriminate against religion. And can I conclude by saying that Australians of family and faith want to be able to live their lives in accordance with their faith and their convictions. They want to be able to bring up their children in accordance with their faith and their convictions. But regrettably, as I have publicly advocated for quite some time, the current bills fall far short of adequately protecting their religious freedom. And it reinforces my view, as I have publicly stated, that sadly, no bill is better than a flawed bill. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
I thank you very, very much, Senator, and give us hope that we have a very strong representative in Canberra. We may need to give you more help, more tangible help, but what you've told us is very instructive, and I'm sure we want to digest it. Now, the Senator did tell me, because of the important things she wanted to say, that she would use her quota of time in speaking rather than questions, and she's probably limited in her time also. So thank you very much. I think we must move on to the next speaker, but you've given us much to think about.
Thank you, Rabbi. And we're still doing things here in Canberra. I'm still in my office in Canberra this evening. So can I thank you all, and can I thank you particularly, Rabbi, for doing this? This is really important. And can I say also, if I may, it's interesting when we do look at people here in Canberra. I have strongly advocated it is really important. We have a lot of so-called conservative politicians here in Canberra. But when push comes to shove, and I noticed in your paper, Rabbi, you referred, and if I may just grab it for a moment, it was very interesting that you said the mobbing of intellect. Can I particularly highlight this point? You talked about the great newspapers once characterised by journalistic independence, balance and quest for objectivity, that they're no longer interested in debate. You're absolutely correct. They have become organs of propaganda, predominantly for a one-sided worldview. You are absolutely right. The universities say no more, and we've had to legislate in relation to freedom of speech at universities. But I think in the end, your comments about groupthink and in the professions, whatever professions they enter. And can I tell you that regrettably, politics too is a situation of groupthink. And whilst many profess to have conservative values and beliefs, when push comes to shove, and we saw it regrettably in the same-sex marriage debate, you know, they decided to put their tin hats on, go into the trenches and come out when it was all over. So I think it's really important. Can I go back to what you said before electorally? Politicians need to stand up for their values and beliefs. They need to say what they mean and mean what they say. So if they do profess to stand for conservative values, now is the time for you and other religious leaders to ensure that they not just do so in words, but they do so in actions. And I think that this bill will really demonstrate those who profess to be conservative politicians. Let's just see where they, you know, if they put their money where their mouth is.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And
thank you.
Once again,
thank you, everyone.
Now, I think we're going to call now on Monica Smith. Monica has had her own travails. Is she with us?
Yes, I am.
Yes, thank you very much. She has had her own travails, but she was, if I'm not mistaken, one of the founders, or the founder of Reignite Democracy Australia. And she subsequently, her party merged with the United Australia Party. And I understand that this group now is gaining a lot of traction in Australia. And we're very pleased to have you with us. And we'll be very grateful to hear from you on the position of the United Australia Party on the issue of religious freedom.
Thank you so much for having me. Rabbi, it's so encouraging to see religious leaders like yourself organising something like this. We need a lot more of them. It's been a little bit difficult as a church member to see religious leaders not standing up. So thank you so much. And I also think that this collective fight for freedom that we're going through is such a great way to bring all faiths together. We might not agree on everything, but one thing we agree on is freedom and the ability to bring up our children the way that we want and not the way that the government wants. So I think that we can build some really great bridges through this. And that's my sort of, positive take on this. And I just wanted to thank Conchetta as well, because it's really great to see a Liberal member speaking up on this. Of course, some people have been a bit disillusioned with the Liberal Party, but there are still really great members within the party. And I think we need to look at individuals instead of an entire party, and give the individuals the credit where credit is due. One point I want to build on that Conchetta mentioned is she kind of mentioned that the Sunday sermons are so important. It's such a great way for leaders to communicate with hundreds of people. And sometimes I go to sermons and I get a little bit annoyed because I think, geez, this is such a great opportunity for them to share so much knowledge and encourage people to do things. And they're not. It's, just quoting things or just, so I hope that more leaders use the sermons as an opportunity to give people encouragement to fight for our freedoms, because we're talking about religious freedoms here, of course, but as you know, all of our freedoms are under attack. Religious freedom is just one of them. If we get freedom back in general, I think we'll have a better chance at getting religious freedom back. I just want to say as well that if any religious leaders do want a platform to speak up, as opposed to just the Sunday sermons or I'm happy to help them on Reignite Democracy Australia. We get 200,000 views on our website a week. So if there's someone there who wants to give out a message, please get in touch. I also wanted to just talk about the UAP and RDA. So RDA has a lobby group and we had a political party as well. They're two separate entities, although they're called the same thing, so it's a bit confusing. I regretted calling it the same, but anyway, that's beside the point. So the RDA party merged with UAP, but RDA as a lobby group is still independent. So we don't owe UAP anything. They don't pay us any money. There's no contracts or anything like that. It's just that we believe they are the winning team to get our freedoms back. And so we're going to support them voluntarily because we just believe in what they do and we want to get our freedoms back, right? So RDA has obviously pretty big lobbying capabilities. So that's where we stand. So I can't actually speak on behalf of UAP on any of these legislations because I'm not actually a part of the party and I don't plan on running either because I just don't really want to go into Parliament. I'd rather be lobbying. Parliament seems really not my thing, to be honest, but I like being on the outside talking about it. So I also want to be clear that, look, I'm not actually a political intellect. So my talk tonight is not really as in-depth as Conchetta's. She obviously is an amazing speaker and knows all about the legislations that's coming up. So, but I think that I hope that I can still inspire some younger people on here or other people who may feel like they don't know enough about politics to have an opinion. Well, that's not true because before COVID, I barely even knew who the Prime Minister was, so you can learn really quickly and you kind of need to because we need you to. And so I wanted to just let you know that. Something I've learned recently, a lawyer said it to me on the phone after they lost the New South Wales case against Hazard. And he said, maybe we've just had an illusion of freedom for decades. So maybe we actually haven't been free for a really long time. I think it's been a really slow burn, like a frog in boiling water sort of situation. And we're really seeing that happening right now because religious freedom and all freedoms are just under attack. Australians have lived obviously a really beautiful life. We've been able to have the time and the luxury to spend time with our family and friends and parent our children, send them to schools that have good values, not schools that just have the word Catholic next to them to charge more money, but actual Catholic schools. We've had those luxuries until now. So it's really shocking for us. And I think I'm part to blame for what's going on right now, because I was also living my life and thinking that nothing bad was happening and that someone else would deal with it. The next generation would have to deal with it, not me. That's fine. I'll just live my life. So I think I'm not putting it all on you guys as well, but I'm saying I have a part to blame in what's going on right now. Now, something I've noticed about the loss of religious freedoms is that religious exemptions for the vaccination don't work in Australia. People have tried. It is working in America because they have a Bill of Rights, but we just basically don't have rights here in this country right now. Obviously, there's a lot of people fighting to get them, but if someone doesn't want to get an injection because of something that is inside that injection for a religious reason, they should be able to say no to it. And the same thing goes with doctors. Conchetta mentioned conscientious objection is written in the doctor's constitution. They should have the right to conscientiously object. So should police, by the way, and parliamentarians and all of those people. But no one's able to use that because our kind of basic freedoms have been taken away. And doctors, of course, they can't do what they want with, abortion referrals and things like that. They can't even tell the truth about science anymore. They'll lose their license. And the only way out of that is for enough of them to stand up and realize that if 10% of the doctors just stood down and stopped practicing, the whole medical field would go into mayhem, and maybe they'd have to change things. But, it's really scary at the moment that even our doctors, who are, part of the smartest people in our country, cannot speak their mind. So it's all part of that. During COVID, actually, before I started Reignite Democracy Australia, I did a video where I interviewed a priest and some parishioners because when COVID shut the churches down, that really hit me hard. I don't go to church every single day, but it really hit me hard that if I needed to go to a priest, I couldn't. If I really needed that, that time in a church, I couldn't go. For me, I was lucky because I was able to live stream the video, the mass. So I actually didn't miss a mass for the whole first lockdown. And I think that gave me the strength to actually do what I'm doing now, which is exciting. But it really broke my heart to see people not being able to go. I mean, church provides an invaluable source of comfort and emotional support for people in a way that you can't explain. And I know this because from 18 to 25, I was totally off the rails. Okay. I was not living a Catholic life at all. And the only thing that brought me back was God. And without him, I don't even know where I would be right now, but it would not be here and I would not be living a good life. I tried the life of the world and it wasn't great. Just so the young people know out there, you don't need to try it. I can tell you it's not great. But the point is when the churches shut down, I got personally affected, and it definitely encouraged me to do what I'm doing now. But also what really encouraged me, and I'm telling you these stories so that you realize that, I didn't just wake up and start Reignite Democracy Australia. It was a process. And it really started for me with the same-sex marriage campaign. Actually. So it was only about a year before then that I had started going back to church and I'd gotten my life back on track. And the same-sex marriage campaign, I got really involved in that. I made a video to talk about the legislation and the ongoing effects of what could happen if this goes through. And it got, over 200,000 views or something like that. And that was kind of when I realized that, oh, geez, maybe I have something to share. Maybe I can influence people in some way. It took me a long time to actually find this purpose, but it started there. And we warned people in that video that the same-sex marriage would have repercussions, that there would be changes to education. And no one believed us. We said that there would be, it would be a slippery slope. That was part of the slogan, I think. And no one believed us. And here we are right now, taking away parental rights. So I'm not trying to say that we were right, but I'm just saying that that's to me where it really started for me in my life anyway. And I remember going to an event, I can't remember who it was held by, but I actually felt scared going to my car wearing a shirt that said, I think it said, just say no, or it's okay to say no. That's right. And I was actually scared that someone would attack me. And that's when for the first time in my life, I had this sort of feeling like, maybe what if I have to die for my faith or for what I believe in or my opinion? That was really when I realized that religious freedom was going away. And I just want to tell you as well that, so that's when I started realizing that I thought I wanted to be some sort of influencer. I just didn't know what. I had this experience where I was driving to see my grandma in her grave, and she was a very holy woman, very beautiful woman. And I was thinking about, how am I going to, make a second video that gets, tons of views, or how am I going to find my purpose after the same-sex marriage campaign was over? And for some reason, I thought that I would have to be secular. I thought that I would hide my faith to get popular, and then I would be like, oh, and by the way, I'm Catholic. But I had this insane message from my Oma, we're Dutch, and she said to me straight out, she said, you won't get anywhere if you hide your faith. That's what she said to me. And from that point onwards, I realized that, no, I'm going to wear my faith on my sleeve. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not ashamed to say grace, in front of people, etc. So that was like a really big turning point for me. And during the same-sex marriage campaign, I also researched the mental effects of people with gender dysphoria. And it was really shocking to me to see how difficult their lives are. They have and it used to be defined, gender dysphoria used to be defined as a mental condition. And during the same-sex marriage, it actually changed, the definition changed to being like a choice more than a condition. And that changed during that campaign. I actually remember one day it was this, and the next day I refreshed it and it had changed. But it is a very difficult lifestyle. And I believe that these people, if they want help, especially if they're actually wanting help, they should be able to get the help that they want from any institution that they want, whether it be a church or a rabbi or a Christian or whatever it is. They should be able to get the help that they want, because the lifestyle is so difficult and the suicide rates are ridiculously high. It's like, sorry, it was so many years ago that I did that research. I can't remember, but what I do remember is that after any sorts of body altering operations, they're actually more likely to commit suicide than before the altering operation. So these things that the government is saying should be free and we should not try and talk anyone out of, they're actually harming people. And guess what they're also doing? Lifelong customers of the pharmaceutical industry. These I would call them victims. They are in and out of psychiatric counseling, doctors, their whole life, until 50%, until I think 50% of them commit suicide. Like, it was a really high number. And so it seems to me like I tried to chase back the money on why would they be pushing for people to be so openly gender dysphoria, like to push it, and I traced back the money and I thought, well, the pharmaceutical industry is making tons of money off these people, off these poor people. And now they can't even get free help from churches and things like that. So it's really scary. We should be helping these people through life instead of forcing them to do things that probably might not help. And I will add a story. In America, I did a 4-hour interview with a man who became a woman, did the operation to become a woman. And literally 3 weeks later, he realized that it didn't make him happy at all. And he became a traditional Catholic, and he's now living a very difficult life because he can't be a husband. He can't be a priest. He literally is just, that way for the rest of his life. And his story is beautiful, but also he told me that he was just sucked into this lifestyle from the people around him and the culture and the media. So all this stuff in the media about how fantastic it is to be this way is actually damaging people. So it's really important to try and help these people as much as possible. So recently, obviously, the legislation came through that parents can't even talk to their children about these issues. That's really scary, of course, because your children can actually report you to the police or something along those lines. Now, it has to be pretty bad for the parents to actually get in trouble. But the point is the legislation is there. And look, parents should not parenting should be done by parents, not by schools, not by the government. But we're looking today, 12-year-olds can get an injection without consent from their parents, and an experimental injection at that, because we all know it is an experiment. It's okay if you've had it. I don't judge anyone, but it is the definition of an experiment, because it's the trials aren't finished until 2023. So the fact that that's happening is also very scary. Obviously, communism is a direct attack on religion. And what we're seeing today, even in the secular world, the freedom movement is definitely non-religious. It is just full of people who are passionate. I think there are a lot of Christians in there and a lot of religious people in there, because that gives you kind of this extra fight. But we are being taken over by communism, whether it's that word or a different word, I don't know. But what is going on is communism. So, I obviously went to jail for my opinions, and the bail conditions were that I wasn't allowed to oppose the current government, and I was the vice president of a political party. How could I do my job if I wasn't opposing the government? That is literally stopping freedom of speech. That is communism. So, look, this isn't the first time that religion has been attacked in history. Obviously, it's literally happening all the time, because evil wants to get rid of us, of course, because we stand up for our convictions and things like that. But when you're feeling a little bit, hopeless, like you can't do anything to stop this, just remember that our ancestors died for religious freedom. They died for just freedom in general. And a lot of them died in cold concrete cells, and no one knew their name. There's no history books written about them. They didn't have Facebook or live streams or what we're doing right now. They just died because they knew they were doing the right thing. I'm not saying you should die for what's going on right now, but I am saying that our fight right now is really not that bad. Like, it's bad. I get it. It's a psychological warfare. It's totally different than bloodshed, because you can't point at it and you can't explain it really easily. You have to understand it to be able to explain it to someone that we're in the battle. But we actually have a little bit of democracy left. So if you're feeling hopeless, I think when I was in prison, I thought about the dead ancestors who fought for our freedoms, and I thought, geez, I've got a bed, I've got pajamas, I've got food, like I'm okay, and we are okay. We have time. We have time to fight. And I'm going to finish pretty much soon, but I just want to encourage, I know that this is being run by Campion College, which is awesome. And I know that there might be some young people watching. And I just want to say that, we really need the young people involved in any way possible, talking to your friends, campaigning for whichever candidate you want. Just get involved. Praying is really great. Obviously, praying is important and necessary. And if that is all you can do, then that's what you should do. But some people use prayer as an excuse to not get involved because it's too much work. So if you know that praying is all you can do, then that's fine. But if you know you can do more, then I think it is your duty and it is your purpose to be here right now to do what you know you can do. Because everyone kind of knows in the back of their mind what they can do. I knew I could do something. I didn't know what it was. And I was crazy to my friends for the last 5 years. And then now here I am doing something. I thought there was something. I was just persistent, and I guess it paid off. But God told me that there was something I could do. I had no idea what it was, but I just kept searching, and I believed in Him that I would find it. So you can do the same thing. And if you've got that little twinge in your conscience, then I know that you're already thinking about it right now as I'm saying it. So you should write down something new that you're going to do tomorrow. And actually, that's pretty much it. I will finish on just this last quote that I came up with in prison, which is, during times of psychological warfare, collective courage of conviction is going to be our strongest weapon. They are trying to break us. They're trying to break our soul, our spirit, our faith. And so the only way to combat that is to not let them break us. So we need to stay strong. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Am I right, Monica, that you can't, are you able to stay longer, or do you have to go now? Because the difference will be whether we direct some questions to you or we save them for later.
I can have a few questions now, and then I'll probably leave after
well, thanks.
that.
Okay, so I think maybe just 2 or 3 questions, brief ones, and then we'll go to the next section. Anna, can you handle those questions, please?
Yeah, thanks. So if anyone wants to ask Monica a question, we've had a lot of comments. I think there's one question here. Just put them in the chat and then I'll take care of them. So I'll read this out for you, Monica. This is from Lionel. Christians use Romans as a justification for obeying leaders like Dan Andrews. I, as a Christian, have encouraged people to see the Constitution as our nation's supreme rule under the biblical authority, and that therefore gives us a right to resist unconstitutional regulations. What do you think?
Well, I think that you can't follow laws that go against your faith and go against the Bible. So I think that could be used as another excuse, like I said, about using just praying as an excuse to not do things. If you take things out of context anywhere in the Bible, it can mean whatever you want. We've seen that happen with the way that people, interpret things. So I think deep down, we all know that you shouldn't follow corrupt laws. And on top of that, it is actually a test of your faith to be instructed to do something unlawful. And I know that there's a fine line, because we do need to listen to authority, and we do need to follow our elders and things like that. So I understand there's a gray area, but where there is no gray area and you know that someone's telling you to do something that is just not the right thing to do, well, you just can't do it. You shouldn't do it.
Another question, please. Any other questions?
Sure. Okay. Let me just replace this here. So another question from Alicia. I'm not sure if this is specifically to Monica, but Monica, I'll put it to you. It is against my faith to alter DNA. Where do we stand with exemptions? What about protections from international human rights treaties?
The thing is there should be, the exemption should work, but we should also have the choice to not get injected. We should also have the choice to go to a cafe without having an experiment. So it's like, I know that everything that they're doing is illegal, and we know that they should give us that exemption, but they just don't care about the law. So it's so difficult, because we all know that this is illegal. So there's all these different legal battles going on, but then the legal battles are finding it hard as well. So the international criminal laws and the international human rights, I believe they would all say that it's unlawful as well, but it's just not really working right now. That's.
I think now I may need to go to the next section. Monica, I want to thank you very much for your presentation. And part of the purpose of this seminar is to identify people who are doing things and whom we can support, to whom we can look with to help, and from whom we can take examples, perhaps, to be active in our own ways. Anyway, thank you very much. And I'm sure we all wish you a very successful political career, even though you say you don't want to go into politics itself, but you should be, somehow you should be part of, you should help to orchestrate a very good political operation. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Now, what I will do now is what I said I would do before. I will be the Honourable Barnaby Joyce's representative. It was quite unintended, but I feel that it is important not to let go of this, because, as I just said, our task is to identify, one of our tasks at all events is to identify political resources, political leaders and individuals who are alert to the needs for protection of religious freedom. So what I'm doing here is, of course, to become, I am not authorized to be the Deputy Prime Minister's spokesman. But what I have done is I have researched words that he said, reports of his comments. I have looked at videos of him on the internet, and I would like to bring out some points from what he said and attempt some elucidations of those points. So the words are his, the elucidations are mine. That disclaimer is made on his behalf. If any, and perhaps this video will come back to him and he will be able to say whether he really meant it or he didn't meant the way in which I intend to elaborate these points. So here are some of the points that the Deputy Prime Minister, who is the leader of the Nationals, has made. And I find it's very important because I believe that he exemplifies the kind of courage which Senator Fioravanti Wells was speaking about. He's a person who has made clear statements about religious freedom. Now, first of all, he took a very strong stand in the Israel Folau case, which is I'm sure everybody knows. It was the case of a rugby player who was a religious Christian who made a statement of religious belief which offended certain people, and he was sacked from the Australian rugby team on that account. So what he actually said was, I am not into banning people on the premise of their belief. How they see their God is completely and utterly their own personal reason. It's up to them how they practice their religion. Now, that is a statement which says, without qualification, that people have a right to practice their religion. And there again, here's another statement from him. He says, I am not here to tell them what they should or shouldn't believe. Now, you may think that this is a rather trite or obvious remark, but if we look at Victorian legislation under the Change of Suppression Act, we find, Suppression and Change Act, what we find there is that the government is actually instructing parents, schools, and ministers as to what they may profess, which beliefs they may teach, and which beliefs they may not teach. A government is actually standing in to say, we will prohibit you from recommending certain of your religious beliefs to your children, students, and congregations. Now, it's very important to understand that to understand how this legislation is on a direct collision course with religious beliefs. And I will spell it out for you. And I will spell out the exact opposition between the religious beliefs, which come from our sources, whether you are a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, a Hindu, a Buddhist, or whatever it is, and what the government is saying to you, the beliefs which it is counterposing to these religious beliefs, and what exactly the conflict is. And one of these is, for example, in this area as has been pointed out by the previous speakers, it all has come very often from the same-sex marriage debate and movement. So, point number one, many traditional religions, many of the traditional religions, and I think is a pretty widespread view, is the belief in the normativity of the marriage of man and woman. In other words, of heterosexuality. That comes from the Bible, it comes from the Quran, it comes from common religious sources. There is a second point, which is also a religious belief. And the second religious belief is that a human being is free to live in accordance with his or her own conscience. When I say free, that is free vis-a-vis him or herself, vis-a-vis one's own constitution, vis-a-vis one's own impulses, vis-a-vis one's own perception, vis-a-vis one's own drives. The definition of freedom and responsibility in religious belief says that the human being is bound to live when it's a conflict between impulse and conscience. The human being is bound to live by conscience and is able to live according to conscience. If the human being were not able to live by conscience, not able to fulfill divine ethics, then these ethics would never have been given. They were not given to robots. They were given to people who have the ability to fulfill them. And yet the state is saying two things which are directly opposite. They're saying, first of all, we reject the religious belief in the normativity of marriage and man and woman. You say we negate it. The second thing is that they say we negate the proposition that the human being is free to change. The human being is free to live in accordance with conscience. What they say is that a human being is necessarily driven by perception and impulse, and the human being cannot battle it. The human being cannot change him or herself. The human being, in other words, is inwardly unfree. So here you have the direct collision between the state, which is legislating that the norms which religious people have are void, and that the second proposition, the human being is free to change, free to live in accordance with conscience, and should therefore be able to access therapy or help or assistance or counsel. They are saying the human being is inwardly unfree. They are directly contradicting a religious belief. They are arbitrating another way, in other words, which beliefs a religious person may hold and which beliefs a religious person may not hold. So that is one particular issue. Now, and by the way, they're backing that up with jail sentences and fines as well. Entering the home, bringing children to report on their parents, and so on and so on. Now, the second thing, freedom of speech. As was mentioned by the senator, we have a situation here where vilification laws come in to muzzle religious people and groups before they even open their mouths. And this is because their beliefs are, quote, likely to offend somebody else. Now, here too, the Deputy Prime Minister has spoken and has said that, again in connection with the case of Israel Folau, that it is utterly just because a person upsets somebody else with their speech, as it was claimed in the case of Israel Folau, that you don't sack a person because you are upset with what they say. Paradoxically, I find it very funny that the people that we claim what an outrage it is to offend somebody, but it's not outrageous to jail the person. In other words, jailing versus offence. It's a very strange balance. At all events, so the words of the Deputy Prime Minister in this particular case is that we've got people who are, very upsetting, and we find them in every office, but we just don't go around sacking them because we find them annoying or upsetting. These are the words of the Deputy Prime Minister. You don't sack a person because he said something or she said something which you're upset with, which you don't like. Now, if it's true that a private employer may not sack a person or should not be able to sack a person because of their religious beliefs, how much more so should the state, should the public arena not be able to muzzle people who, because it's conceivable that their opinions might upset somebody else. After all, the state is supposed to be the arena of public discussion, for the free play of opinion. So it seems to me quite clear from the Deputy Prime Minister's words over here is that any attempt to contain free speech through these so-called vilification laws is completely out of hand. Finally, I would like to make reference to a number of things which he said, which the Deputy Prime Minister said in relation to the ethos of schools and the legislation being undertaken to damage the ethos of schools. So what do we find? First of all, we find that there is an issue here of whom may one employ. In other words, a religious school not only teaches its students things, it models an ethos. Any parent knows that if you say one thing and you do the opposite, you're a poor parent. The same thing goes for a school. A school can teach, but if the school doesn't exemplify the values which it teaches, the child gets the opposite message. And that's why schools, religious schools, rightly insist that they should be able to have the ethos of the institution, as it is represented by all the staff, should be something which at least is not contradictory to its ethos. And not everybody may be a believer, but to manifest lifestyles and values which contradict the ethos of the school is to vitiate, is to nullify the whole effect of the school as a religious, as educational religious institution. And so it's interesting that when he was speaking about Israel Folau, he said that there has to be a nexus between the consideration of beliefs and the role the person is playing. So in the case of Israel Folau, he was employed as a rugby player. And a rugby player, to playing rugby is not necessarily improved or worsened by your religious beliefs. So what has it got to do with it? It's nothing. If there were a nexus, then we could argue. Now, maybe we can use this formulation of the Deputy Prime Minister in the case of religious schools. There is a nexus between employment and belief. In other words, when a person is employed to work in a religious school, it's understood that that person will not detract from the purpose, the function of the school, which is to impart the values of the school. This will not disturb the communication of those values. Now, if a person has beliefs which are contrary to the school, then that is grounds to dismiss a person, because there the nexus does exist. The person was engaged to support the ethos of the school. And the person's belief, in this case, if you like, strident manifestation of values which are contrary to the religious beliefs of the school, well, that is a clear instance of a nexus, of a connection which is harmful. In other words, it's not satisfying the purposes of the school itself. It's their belief is important, and they have the belief which is inappropriate to the institution. Finally, I would like to mention something which the Deputy Prime Minister mentioned in regard to this was in an interview on Sky News in relation to the right of a religious school to decline to accept a transgender child, a boy who, let us say, a biological boy who identifies as a girl, and that this boy should, this religious school, which is an all-girls school, should have the right not to take this child, who will now want to use the girls' change rooms and toilets and so on, and is in fact a biological boy. Now here we have again a classical opposition of values. The religious sources say, traditional religious sources say, that the definition of a boy is a biological boy, and is a male who's biologically male. The definition of a girl, a female, is a person who is biologically female. You do not become, because you simply identify as a member of the opposite sex, that does not make you a member of the opposite sex. That is part of religious teaching, and when legislation seeks to force a religious school, a parent body which is committed to a certain set of religious values, to negate their beliefs, to allow a belief that a girl becomes a male simply by identifying as such, and for that reason alone could go into a girl's change room or a girl's toilet. This is actually, in the words of Minister Joyce, it is a usurpation of the ethos of the school. It is a demolition of the ethos of the school. And so it needs to be very clearly understood that we're talking here about an actual negation of religious beliefs. The government, this legislation wants to tell a religious person which beliefs they can have and which beliefs must be deleted from their faith. And this is simply a patent negation of the fundamental human right to believe and to practice one's belief. It needs to be very understood, even though it poses as science, it poses as some kind of spurious objectivity. But what it is one set of assumptions, a set of radically secular beliefs out to punish and to demolish another set of beliefs, which are the beliefs of traditional faith. So I mentioned all of this, and I'm pleased that I was able to stand in. I know that Mr. Joyce wanted to be represented, and I hope that I have represented him reasonably well, because it's a voice which needs to be appreciated, and it's a voice which others should take courage from. Now I'm going to revert to my role as one of the hosts of this evening, and I'm going to ask if Steve Campbell is here. Steve Campbell?
Yes, Rabbi.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to invite Steve, who is in Perth. Steve is a friend of mine. I've known him for many years. He was the Chief of Staff of John Maddison. Is that correct, Steve?
Yeah, John Madigan. Yes,
John
Senator
Madigan. John Madigan, who was he was originally a DLP senator. He had a very long career with the DLP, the Democratic Labour Party. It's now called Labour DLP, and Steve is the federal secretary of the Labour DLP Australia. We're pleased to hear your views on the issue of religious freedom.
Thank you, Rabbi. First of all, a great honour to actually be here, especially after the people who've just spoken. I mean, if this was a concert, they'd be my supporting acts, and I definitely do not feel in the same category as them. As you've said, we've known each other for a fair while. I'm actually pleased to be able to come and speak here. For those who don't know, not a recruiting drive for the party. I'll give you a very brief overview of who we are. The Democratic Labour Party has been around since 1955, and what basically occurred, there was one Labour Party, Communist Party infiltrated the Labour Party. There was a split, which out of that came two Labour parties, the Australian Labour Party and the Democratic Labour Party. We ended up holding the balance of power for probably the next 20, 25 years, federally and state, especially Victoria, and then slowly diminished. In the last probably 15 years, we've come back, had more members of parliament in Victoria and federally, and are now trying to push back against what we see as another left-wing communist, as Monica has put quite well, actually, another communist push against our liberties, religious liberty being the one was discussed. Well, I don't think it's a separate issue. I think religious liberties are basically the foundations of all the liberties that we have. In Australia, we have seen over the years attacks consistently for many, many years on every aspect of our lives. Victoria today is a very good example of what's happened in the past and will continue into the future. Monica's right. There have been some horrendous fights for liberty in general throughout the world, in this country as well. But we've probably we're in a position where we have to stand up, fight for our rights now, but we're certainly not in a position where we're going to be laying down our lives, at least not yet. I know the loss of liberty generally means that blood has to be spilled, but at the moment we're in a position where hopefully things will come about. We'll actually find a bit of sense. One of the biggest problems for us, a party such as the Democratic Labour Party, is we are a small party. We're what's referred to as a minor party. We are run by volunteers. Every one of us, we have branches across the entire country. We have no paid members. Every one of us basically gives what time and money and effort we can to promote the principles, the Judeo-Christian principles of the party, of our history. We are basically the only, there's the CDP and the Australian Christians still exist. We're the only pro-life party left in this country other than that. We're certainly the only party that's rolled in legislation federally and state to roll back abortion. I can give you any number of accounts of the euthanasia campaigns we've had. Some of the John Madigan's campaign to roll back the funding for abortion. He's campaigned for against same-sex marriage, which unfortunately, strangely, we actually got the support of the Australian Labor Party, but couldn't get the Liberal Party. This is the anomaly of what goes on in federal parliament, not only federal, but in the state. The horse trading that needs to be done. And I know I'm speaking more about politics here, but this is because politics is what's driving this lack of, currently driving this lack of liberty, this attack on liberty. And this is where it needs to be resolved at the moment. It has to be resolved at the street. But at the moment, we've got politicians who have right across the board, and I think even Senator Karavanti-Wells mentioned that, politicians who pretend that they basically believe in certain things and don't do it. I think one of the basic things I always say to everybody is approach your members of parliament, approach your senators, ask every one of them the questions that you want answered, and ask them to actually speak about it publicly, because if they will not do it before an election, they're definitely not going to do it after an election. Now, the senators spoke about the religious liberty bills that they were talking about. This has been something that's been going on for years. We have put in, I don't know how many submissions. We have approached so many politicians, so many federal and state members of parliament on these issues. We have made, our power is in preference arrangements. You know, both parties or all parties want our preferences at elections. So that's where our power lies, in being able to offer preferences in return for, you know, proper actions by members of parliament, or in actually being able to get somebody into parliament instead of just standing aside and just letting the others just go ahead with whatever they want to do. So what I would suggest to you is get people to actually pay attention to what's going on in parliament. Have your members of parliament open up to where they actually stand and where they actually believe on these issues, and make sure that they actually live up to them. Now, I'm not going to speak about particular politicians, particular names. Senator Fierravendi Wells is very good, and she's well respected within our party and by many, many others. And there are several other members of parliament who are as well. With religious liberties today, the main thing I see is an attack going on liberties in general, but on religious liberties within the state of Victoria. I am in West Australia at the moment, simply because this is part of my moving around for the party. But normally I'm based in Victoria. As far as anybody in the party in the DLP, and actually most of the minor parties that we deal with, even some of the ones on the left, and I know the line between left and right is blurred these days, but in all honesty, there are parties on the left that are utterly disgusted at what is going on in the state of Victoria. At the conversion bill, for instance, which the Rabbi spoke about and is written so wonderfully in that paper that he's put out, in that conversion bill, the main opposition, the only opposition in the upper house, basically came from the crossbenchers, people that you wouldn't necessarily think would pay much attention, minor parties who mightn't be big hitters when it comes to taxation bills or to transport bills or things like that. When it comes to ethical issues and ethical bills, they really pay attention. They put in an effort because they know they're representing the heart and soul of the people who voted them into the parliament. Now, the Liberal Party, for instance, in that, and this is not an attack on the Liberal Party per se, but the Liberal Party would do nothing. They abstained. I mean, I have no idea. If you're going to stand up for a value, you stand up and you shout it from the rooftops. As I said, if you're not going to do it before an election, you won't do it after an election. So to find people who will not stand up for religious liberties and the liberties of the people who actually voted them in is rather appalling. It is a great disappointment. So when it comes to the religious liberties that you understand and enjoy, it is up to you to defend those, and not just by voting for parties like us. I'm not asking for votes, not asking for memberships and that sort of thing. I'm asking for people to get more involved with politics broadly, to actually understand what's going on and what's being said. Don't just listen to me. Don't just listen to the rabbi or the senator or Monica, who spoke so brilliantly. Don't just listen to them. Go out, find out for yourself, research in it, find out. And I'm sure you do. Campion College is a wonderful place, and you do such, there's a lot of great things coming out of Campion College, but just get in there and actually find out what's going on. One of the problems is that there seems to be a dearth of political activity amongst the average person compared to what it was many years ago. When I was young, and it's not going back to history. When I was young, my family were all members of the Democratic Labor Party. My grandfather was beaten up in the streets because of his beliefs. We had a pig's head thrown through the window, things like that. I'm not saying do that, but I'm saying there was activity going on constantly on one side or another. People knew what was going on and people actively spoke out about things. Now people have got so many other things in their lives. And the COVID situation has not helped, that quite frankly, people are not probably paying as much attention as they should to the ongoing situation in the parliaments, especially the Victorian one. And as Victoria goes, possibly other states will follow. The bill, for those who aren't aware, the bill that was just put in today into the state parliament in Victoria was effectively a bill that gives complete and utter rights to the Premier of Victoria over this pandemic. And continuing rights that will just allow him to sweep away the rights, religious rights as well, of the average Victorian, just simply because it grants him a little bit more power. Now, religious liberties have taken a hell of a knocking over the last year or two, certainly over the last decade or two, but in the last year or so, the thought that you could not even attend a church, you could not attend a synagogue or a temple, that you were refused entry to any of these places, and possibly even will if you don't have a vaccine passport in the future, is just appalling. I mean, the idea that a party or a politician such as the Premier or a party of any sort can actually impose that sort of restriction is just appalling. So when it comes down to religious liberties, these are one of the things that we can't afford to let slip. I'm not going to promise that we'll do anything. We'll just fight like as we have before. We'll continue to fight. We and others, Monica, the UAP, parties like that, they need support. Every person out there who is trying to do the right thing needs support. As well as that, you've got people like Rabbi Shimon. You've got people from whatever denomination you come from who are fighting for their religious beliefs, who want to stand up for it. What I'd like to see is probably a little more. This idea of separation of church and state seems to be the church doesn't get involved in the state, but the state does anything it wants to the church. Now, religious leaders probably need to come out and say more. I can't speak on their behalf. I can only say what I think. So, look, all I'd say, my hope is that the quiet majority of people out there have taken a licking for a fair while and getting pretty fed up with a lot of this. And you've heard a lot of quotes, and you get quotes today, and you've had quotes from religious leaders and politicians about various things. But one of the ones, when it comes to this sort of thing, that sticks in my mind, and it's a bit of an odd source, is from the Japanese Admiral Yamamoto at the start of the Second World War, when, after coming back from Pearl Harbor, having destroyed, and I know this is an odd thing as a quote, but having destroyed the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, his officers were asking him, "Why aren't you overjoyed?" And his answer was, "I fear all we've done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. And my hope is that what's happening today is to awaken the sleeping giant that is the religious belief in our community, and to fill it with a resolve to go out and take those rights back." So I won't go on anymore. I just want to congratulate the Rabbi on a good, wonderful presentation and bringing people together, and also on a wonderful paper. And I hope to speak to you about that soon, Rabbi.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's been quite an inspiring group of speakers. I'm not inspiring. The people I represent are inspiring. But now I suggest that what we do now, I don't know who's with us still. I think only Steve. I don't know if Monica is with us still or the Senator. I don't think so. How about we allow a few minutes of questions or discussion, just comments, any questions to Steve or other comments, and then we go to Stephen Chavura to wrap things up. So Anna, can you take questions? A few questions, please.
Yes, Rabbi, that's not a problem. I did have one or two questions for Steve. Debbie asks, would the DLP consider partnering with any other parties? And what can be done at the state or local level to combat the bad state laws?
Usually after every election, this question comes up about amalgamating with other parties, because we'll look around and every party gets a certain percentage of the votes, and people think if you all join together, you'd get the lot. But the truth is, people join the Democratic Labor Party because, one, we are a Labor Party. Our principles are traditional Labor, which is pre-socialist. We're a distributist party, and I won't go into those economic principles. But we have certain beliefs. We're also an ethical party. We're pro-life, etc. And there's so many parties out there that aren't. So there are some of our principles or our policies that we can never abandon, and other parties would not necessarily accept those principles. We will work with others, and we quite openly work with other political parties to try and assist with preferences. Even though the majors, Liberals and the ALP, try to destroy us constantly, we try to work together. So the best thing we can do is to is to share preferences. And I'll give you just one example of why amalgamation doesn't really work in most cases. A number of years ago, you had Corey Bernardi came out and joined and formed the was Australian Conservative Party. He went around and just very quickly swallowed up Family First all over the country, a number of other organisations, and he came to Victoria. We had a member of Parliament at the time who then was persuaded to join the Australian Conservatives. She still did wonderful work, don't get me wrong. And they wanted to take over the DLP. Well, one, we didn't see eye to eye on a number of policies, but two, we're our own party and we didn't want to amalgamate. If we had, we would now be gone, just as Family First is gone, Australian Conservatives and the other organisations. We've existed as a party that's stood on certain principles, and we have to stay that way. We will easily and quite often do work with a lot of other minor parties to help get not just us, but one of their representatives in, and we represent each other when we get in. And as for the state and federal question, everybody says join a political party. I'm going to say something very radical and it's long term. The DLP actually believes in another thing, not just getting ourselves into Parliament. Politics does corrupt. We all know that. And no matter how good you are, how much you want to do, I have seen so many politicians who've been in there 30 years who've then gone out only to say, if only I had one more term, all the good I could have done. DLP members go in for one term. We expect to never get voted back in, so you do everything you can in that 4-year or whatever term. Our other intention is we want to get people from local communities involved in politics, and we do. And I'm talking about this way: every community where you live, every one of you, there are people around you who live magnificent, totally self-sacrificing lives, but they never get any reward for it. They are the people that you need to get and place in as independents to run in those communities, well known in the community for being self-sacrificing. These people can get elected to Parliament, not representing any party, representing you. Once they're in Parliament, they are the ones, they do not bow to power. They do what's right. So we would like to see more and more local community independents elected, and we'd be only too happy to back them. And that is, my opinion, the best way that we can change state and federal Parliament.
Thanks, Steve. I have 2 more questions for you from Lionel. So Lionel asks, if I understand the bill's process, it passed lower house today and has to go to the upper house where it will likely pass. What steps can we do now? And he also asks, are there any states in Australia that are defending Australian constitution rights?
Ooh, that second one is a toughie, because no, I don't think there are any states that are defending it. There are some that haven't completely collapsed, I think, but it's only because there are elections coming up in certain states and they don't want to do anything until after the elections, similar to the religious liberties bill that the senator was talking about. If the government brings them up and they're going to be held over until after the election, then the government must come out and state that they will put them back on the table the instant they get back to Parliament. None of this, oh, we'll look at them when we get back. No, you need to have a perfect religious liberty bill put up there, ready to go, and it'll go in after the Parliament's returned. If they don't commit to that, they're not going to do it. As for the bill in the upper house, look, yes, the ALP is going to vote in favour. Look, it's going to vote in favour of it. The Greens, etc. It's going to be very tight, and it's going to come down to one vote. I would suggest pray. I know I'm not kidding. It's not a flippant remark. I mean pray, because if anything's ever going to convert any of these politicians, it's prayer. But when it comes down to it, it is you, me, other minor parties, and I know a number of us are doing it already, contacting every one of those crossbenchers because they're the key, and letting them know exactly where you stand on it and how the people that you represent and the people you know stand on these issues. We're basically advising people, you vote the wrong way, not only will we not preference you, we will actually actively campaign and put candidates up against you to draw those votes away from you. Now, it doesn't mean the person who's going to come in after them is going to necessarily be better. We hope they are, but politicians who are in that camp have to be threatened with losing their political career. That is the only thing they fear, the loss of votes, and especially with the ALP. This is the rabbi mentioned before, the Democratic Labor Party is also known as Labor, DLP. For those who don't know, it's because the Supreme Court of Victoria many years ago determined that we were the original Labor Party, not the ALP. So we're very proud of that. But with us standing as another Labor Party, when we do stand in the Labor electorate and promote ourselves, we get a very high vote, and that vote comes directly from the ALP. So what that means is for those members of parliament who are going to vote the wrong way know that if we campaign against them, there is a very good chance that they'll lose their seat, as has happened on a number of occasions, and the government can be changed. The federal government that's in at the moment, it's in by 2 seats. We got the Liberal Party 2 seats at the last election. So in other words, preferences change governments. So that's basically all I can suggest. We're going to push it as much as possible. Just contact politicians and let them know that you will actively campaign against them if they don't vote the right way. Don't be afraid to threaten a politician. I mean, not physically, but you know what I mean.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. I think, Anna, we might now ask Dr. Stephen Chavura to wrap things up. If that's all right.
I have a couple more questions for you,
right.
Rabbi, if you want to answer them. Otherwise, we can head straight on to, because we've got a couple minutes that we can.
I wonder if I'm going to be accused of favoritism towards myself. I just said that's the end, and now I'm taking one. Or I'll try one question. Let's have one question. Thank you.
Just one, okay. We'll ask the first question that was asked for you. Lionel asks, Rabbi, why do you think our government is so strongly pushing in such a strong anti-religious and anti-family unit direction? What is the big picture in your opinion?
It's a very hard, I don't know really why it's all about. We call it zeitgeist. It's the spirit of the times. It's there's a dominant ideology, and an ideology is like a huge chimera, a huge mirage. Everybody thinks it's reality. Now, I very much like the parable, the idea of the sleeping giant and the idea of a resistance, because it can collapse in a moment. Ideologies grip societies and politics, and people think this is the way it is and there's no other way. Well, so how it happened, I don't know. But all I know is that it can go. And I really think that if the more people speak up, the less people are daunted, the less people are afraid, the more people call a spade, and they speak these words about God, about faith, that the human being's got a soul, the human being's got a conscience, and this is the supreme authority within the human being, just as God is a supreme authority within the cosmos, beyond the cosmos, then this will change. In other words, it's up, it can be changed. And please goodness, we'll merit very soon to see it change also. Well, I granted myself one question. Maybe now I have to hear it. We'll go to Dr. Stephen Chavura, who is my colleague and champion, to give us a brief wrap up.
It's a great honor to be here, and thank you very much, Rabbi, for organizing it, and thank you very much, Anna, for all the work that you've done making it happen. I trust you can all hear me as well, by the way. So I'll probably speak a lot to that last question about the zeitgeist. I'll look at this situation we're in currently from broadly a historical point of view, really to give us some idea of how we got to where we are. First thing I would want to say is that ultimately religious freedom is not grounded in national law. It is not grounded in international law. It's grounded in something far deeper and actually far more objective than that. It's grounded in human nature. It's grounded in the very fact that we as human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. All of our rights, all real rights have an objective grounding in human nature and human flourishing. That's the objective grounding. And the fact that we should pay attention to all of that, the fact that we should look to human nature and say that should be a guide to our rights, that in itself hinges on the fact that human beings are created by a good God. And so all of this ultimately goes back to God, who has given us a human nature that we are to honor in our honoring of God. Humans by nature wonder. Humans by nature want to understand the meaning of life, the meaning of existence. But humans also not just want to understand the meaning of life, human beings want to live in accordance with what their understanding of the meaning of life is. And there springs our religious sensibilities, from that human desire to want to know why we exist and how we ought to live. And so again, to any restrictions on religious freedom must only be done under the most grave and serious circumstances, because you are restricting an activity that is absolutely intrinsic to our human nature. And the very purpose of rights is to protect the very things that are intrinsic to the human nature that constitute our human flourishing. And when you get rid of the idea of this natural law, which I've just described, then all you have is the state. All you have is the government, and the government effectively becomes the natural law. The government effectively becomes God, which is exactly what's taking place around the West. It's certainly taking place right now in Victoria. And therefore, even the Federation Fathers who wrote our Constitution believed in religious freedom. Alfred Deakin, at the end of the constitutional debates in the 1890s, said, he marveled, he said, what a charter of liberty is embraced within this bill of political liberty and religious liberty. So the Federation Fathers believed in freedom of religion, and it was enshrined in Section 116 of the Constitution, although the way that's been interpreted subsequently is questionable in many ways. Now, it's no secret that religious freedom is now coming under attack. If you don't believe me, and I have a feeling most of you do, because that's why you're here, go to the Human Rights Law Alliance website, the Human Rights Law Alliance website, and they will give you stories of dozens of people who have been discriminated against in their workplaces or have fallen foul of some kind of law because of their religious beliefs, usually around sexuality and gender. Which brings me to the next point I want to make. Where has this hostility, or the kind of hostility that religionists are experiencing, where has it come from historical? So what's this zeitgeist that Rabbi Cowen was talking about just earlier? Well, I mean, it goes back hundreds of years, really, but most recently in history, in the 1960s and 70s, the West went through a moral revolution where Christian morality was basically thrown away and replaced by a new kind of morality, a morality of self-expressivism, a morality of I suppose hyper sort of individualism, but also a morality that was a product of the sexual revolution that took place in the 1960s and 70s, when Christian notions of healthy sex, of healthy sexuality, that is, sex should be kept within marriage between a man and a woman, and sexuality should be between a man and correct or holy sexualities between a man and a woman in marriage. That was cast aside during the 1960s and 70s, especially in what we often call the sexual revolution. But that's actually important for understanding why religious freedom is currently under attack. Religious freedom historically has always had its limits. So in very, very religious societies, let me give you an example. So in England, England had a kind of religious freedom, except for any religions which were deemed to be dangerous for society. And in the English mindset, up until the 19th century, the religion that was most dangerous to society was probably Catholicism. because Catholics were deemed dangerous because they had allegiance to the Pope, who was a foreign power. And so the English sort of said, well, we have religious freedom, but because that group is dangerous, they can't enjoy the religious freedom that everyone else enjoys. So religious freedom historically has always had its limits, and those limits have always depended on what is deemed by governments to be dangerous. Now, since the sexual revolution has taken place, public morality has changed, and it has shifted so far away from Christianity that Christianity is increasingly not just being seen as irrational by people, and even just kind of a wrong sort of morality. It's actually now getting to the point where Christianity is being seen as harmful. We're also living in an age, this is another part of the zeitgeist, an age in which happiness has become sort of the most important thing in life. And to quote one particular writer, we've sort of moved away from this idea that everyone has the right to pursue happiness. And we now seem to almost believe that people have a right to be happy. People have a right to be happy. And the problem with the idea that people have a right to be happy is that means if I have a right to be happy and you have said something that makes me deeply unhappy, does that mean that you have violated my rights? And if you have violated my rights, then I should be allowed to appeal to the government to punish you, because that's exactly why we have governments, to stop violations of other people's rights. And so the more we have centralized happiness, individual happiness and individual self-esteem as the good life, and the more we see self-esteem and happiness as a right, the more we consider people who say things and ideas and religions that say things that might make us unhappy to be immoral, and not just immoral, but harmful. And it's very important. There's a reason the word harm is being used so much these days, because even in a free, liberal, democratic state, there is still this principle called the harm principle. And John Stuart Mill, the famous liberal philosopher in the 19th century, spoke about it. He famously said that the government only has a right to interfere in our liberties and our freedoms if our actions harm others. So here's where we are right now, historically. Christianity, because of a moral revolution which has taken place, which has changed the way we think about sex and sexuality, it's changed the way we think about gender, and the way we think about these things now makes the Christian ideas on sexuality and gender so foreign as to be alien and dangerous and now harmful. Well, now we're starting to think that the government has a right to limit people's religious speech and to punish people for practicing their religion or speaking their religious views because they are violating the principle that you should not, because they are deemed harmful, and therefore the government has a right to intervene and punish. And that's exactly what the conversion therapy bill in Victoria is all about. And that's exactly what was happening with Israel Folau. We remember with Israel Folau, the accusation against Folau was not that what Folau said was offensive. People don't say offense. People don't talk about offensive words so much anymore. What the argument against Folau was that his words are harmful, that they are harmful, and that's much more serious than just offensiveness. Because when you say someone's words and someone's deeds and someone's religious beliefs are harmful, that licenses the government to step in and start imposing penalties and those sorts of things. So what is our response? What is the response of religionists to all of this? Well, I think, first of all, our response should be to point out that study after study after study indicates that in actual fact, religion is actually really good for people's physical health, and it's actually really good for people's mental health. So if the principal argument nowadays against religious liberties is that these religious ideas are harmful, one response we want to give back is to say that in actual fact, if you really care about health, if you really care about mental health, and if you really care about the health of families, then in actual fact, you won't pass laws that discourage religion and that limit religious expression. Because in actual fact, if there's a settled sociological fact out there, it is that regular participation in religious worship and religious communities is actually really good for people's health. It's a really good thing. So the worst thing you could do to pursue public health and to avoid harm to people's mental health is to discourage religion. In fact, it should be encouraged all the more. And there are fantastic stats and studies out there on that. I would encourage you, I recorded a 30-minute talk for the Australian Christian Lobby in 2019 entitled, "Is Christianity Harmful?" But you could just as easily change the title to, "Is Judaism Harmful?" And the answer to the question is, of course, no. And I cite all the papers indicating the actual health benefits of religion. And I offer arguments against this idea that Christianity is harmful. But that is the new frontier. And that is why we're experiencing this assault on religious liberty nowadays, because traditional religious ideas of sexuality and of gender are now deemed harmful because of a revolution that has taken place over the last 40 years in how we think about sexuality and in how we think about gender. The other thing I would say that we need to tell people is that it's not just religionists who need to be worried about incursions on religious freedom. People who want to see religious freedom minimized and people who want to see speech regulated, not necessarily people who are just going to stop at religion. You see, a lot of this is in the name of essentially stopping any criticism of, again, new thinking about sexuality, and especially new think about gender and transgenderism. And it's not just religionists who might have something to say about the idea that someone can just choose whatever sex or gender they want to be. It's not just religionists who might have an objection to transgender ideology. And so protecting religious liberty is not just protecting religionists, it's sending a message to these bullies, these activist bullies and these MP bullies who want to limit religious freedom. It's sending a message to them saying it's not just religionists that you're going to have to deal with if you want to ban speech about sexuality and transgenderism that falls foul of the politically correct orthodoxy. It's a whole bunch of other people as well. Germaine Greer, a radical feminist. She's certainly no religionist. She's no Christian. She's no Jew. She's no Muslim. She has been banned from campuses because she has rejected transgender ideology. J.K. Rowling, the famous author, they attempted to cancel her, but she's too famous and too rich to be cancelled. So good on her. In Australia, at Melbourne University, you've got Holly Lawford Smith, a philosophy professor at Melbourne University. She's not religious, from what I can tell. She's a self-identified feminist and lesbian, and she has spoken out against transgender ideology, and they've tried to cancel her as well. So this is not just about religious people, it's about anyone who wants to say anything that falls foul of political correctness, especially when it comes to sexuality and gender. So that's one thing we need to make very, very clear. And just the last thing I would say for religionists, if we truly believe in I'm going to speak broadly right now about the Bible. And if we truly believe that the Bible is inspired and that the biblical teaching on what it is to be a human being, on sexuality and on gender, that these things are not just true, but they're actually good for us as human beings, then we cannot but believe that in the long run, these deviations from biblical revealed truth about who we are as human beings must lead in the long run to social disaster. They must lead to what we might call the immiserization of society, because people are deviating from a plan for how we ought to live, which God gave to us because it is good for us, because it is in accordance with our nature. And we're seeing a lot of this now. We're seeing the fruits of the sexual revolution. In the way women have found that they haven't exactly flourished out from the free love movement and that kind of thing. And we're seeing the fruits now of, I would say, even sort of transgenderism, of people regretting having transgender surgery. And we're going to see it with children who are brought into same-sex couple families, and they get to an age and they ask, who's my mother, who's my father? And the parents will say, I don't know, I'm sorry. We're going to see it all unravel, and it has to unravel. And in the meantime, what we as religionists need to be is absolutely faithful to our own principles, so that as it unravels and people look for something else, they'll look at us and they'll say, wow, you guys seem to have a joy and sort of a togetherness that we want. What do you have? What went wrong? And the answer, well, I mean, Jesus gives us encouragement, and I'll end on this. He says, this is Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 onwards. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. So fight, have courage, and live according to your principles, and we will prevail absolutely. I lectured all day yesterday. You can hear my voice is giving way, so I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you to all of our participants. Thank you, Anna, and thank you to everybody. And we all end up, I'm sure, with a common prayer and resolve that we will change things, and we'll change them soon. Good night, and bless you all. Thank you very much.